and how he might govern if elected president. Now John Anderson, the independent presidential candidate in 1980. He spoke yesterday about third-party candidacies at a forum on campaign politics and the media. Mr. Anderson is a former 9-term Illinois congressman and currently president of the Center for Voting and Democracy. It's 1 hour.
That's it. Do we have internal sound here? Are you guys able to hear in the back? You're not? Is there any kind of amplified sound in the room here?
Maybe there's a button you got to turn on.
Yeah.
Button. Who's got the button?
Hello. Now we got it? Okay. Just wanted to be sure we had it. And as you know, we have C-SPAN with us again. So y'all be good now, you hear? We'll give folks just a few more seconds to sit down. If everybody could take your seats, please. And these two sessions are not the one to get up and walk out in the middle. No matter what calls. Okay. We want to welcome our television audience to this very special program where we're going to be hearing from a man who made history as a candidate for president who did not have a party, and he still made a significant impact on a national presidential election. Former Congressman and former candidate John Anderson is going to be with us as our special guest this afternoon. I'm Steve Bell, a professor of telecommunications at Ball State University, and the faculty director this week for a 2-week seminar called Campaign Politics and the Media. This is sponsored by the Washington Center for Internships and Academic Seminars, a wonderful organization here in our nation's capital, which provides Washington experiences, both internships and seminars, for college students from around the country. These programs are run by the center for universities and colleges throughout the country, and we at Ball State are participating, and I can tell you firsthand what a wonderful opportunity the Washington Center provides for the students who take part in these Washington programs. All week long, we have been looking at the impact of the media on politics, and today we are so fortunate to have John Anderson, longtime congressman from the state of Illinois. I can say quite honestly, a very popular man here in Washington on both sides of the aisle, as they say, when he was a member of Congress. And then as an independent candidate for president, he created real waves in American politics. And he's here to talk to us about that today in the context of the media and politics. John, thank you so much for joining.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. In the expression, Steve, I hardly knew ye, when you were a part of that pack of media that pursued me around the campaign trail. I didn't realize that one day you would achieve the eminence that you have achieved in your present position of holding an endowed chair at Ball State University. And having joined the professorial ranks myself a number of years ago to teach at Nova Southeastern University Law School, to teach constitutional law, I think that probably like me, you have been redeemed for an even nobler service to humankind than the one that you performed as an active and very well-known and popular member of the media. Well, I suppose that I will appear to you from my introduction as a voice from the past, and in a sense, indeed, that's what I am. I would rather, I guess, in modern parlance, be looked upon as a blast from the past. And Steve gave me a little entree into pursuing that theme, maybe, by referring to my 1980 campaign. I promise you I'm not going to spend all of the time simply offering you a reprise of the events of 1980, but they were relevant, or they are still relevant, I think, with respect to the overall topic that I believe you have been considering, and that is the role of the media in American politics. That leads me, of course, to the conclusion that there are two types of media. There is the media you pay for, the media that portrays you to the voters on radio, and nowadays more often and principally on television, in paid commercial advertising, paid political advertising, and then there are the media events that a candidate sometimes will stage, sometimes events will combine to make it possible for him to seize the news by being present at the right time and in the right place and be part of the news of the day. In my particular campaign, we had to rely much more on the latter category of appearances on television and in the media, principally because by the time we got to the general election, running as an independent candidate, most of our funds had been expended simply in the task of getting on the ballot. And we spent literally millions of dollars fighting lawsuits from one end of this country to the other. One case even went to the Supreme Court and was decided in 1983, which was 2.5 years after the election had taken place. But in the slow appeals process, it didn't reach the highest court of the land, the U.S. Supreme Court, until that year. And in a 5-4 decision in my favor, I'm pleased to say, Justice John Paul Stevens, writing for the majority, said that there is a right under the Constitution for independent candidates not to suffer discrimination, which I was alleging with respect to my candidacy, and it came about in this wise, that I had not decided until April of 1980 that I would leave the ranks of the Republican Party and seek the presidency as an independent. By that time, in April, the state law of Ohio had said that your petitions had to be filed or you could not be on the November ballot, even though the election was 5 or 6 months away. In contrast to that, the two major parties would certify their candidates after their conventions, which were held in late July and in August, and they had until sometime in September to certify candidates for the general election ballot. We said that that was discriminatory, that to foreclose the opportunity of an independent candidate to even have his name appear on the ballot was unfair, and as I say, a majority of the court agreed with us. So I have been for the last 20 years a member of that great fraternity of voters that don't belong to either major party but classify themselves as independents. And incidentally, in one of the very first contests, namely on the 1st of February, up in the state of New Hampshire, the last time I looked at the figures, it was estimated that anywhere between 35% and 40% of the voters of that state who would be participating in that much talked about, highly discussed primary would be independent voters, free to choose a nominee in either party. And that, of course, will be an interesting test of the ability of independents winning not with a candidate of their own, because I don't believe there are any independents running in the February primary in New Hampshire, but they may well determine who the Republican or Democratic nominee will be. So the power of independence in this country is growing. In the state of Florida, where I have spent part of the year for more than a decade now as a visiting professor, as I told you a moment ago, increasingly voters have been registering as independent rather than seeking a home in either major party. And there was a great burst in registration after the passage of the so-called Motor Voter Act. I think it became effective in 1993, which allowed people to register at the same time that they were filling out an application for a driver's license, visiting various government offices to do other business. And I think welfare offices were included, much to the dismay of the Republicans, but people going to welfare offices were permitted the opportunity to register at the same time. My point in mentioning all of this is that increasingly, since the enactment of that legislation, a larger and larger segment of the electorate has registered as independents. But going back to the division that I made as far as media are concerned, of the free media and the paid media, I found that it was very difficult for me after the major party conventions had been held, as I said, in July and August of 1980. Then the media began to focus even more exclusively on major party candidates, emphasizing what is all too often, I am afraid, the failing of the media, and that is to exploit the contest aspect of the campaign. Who's ahead? Who's falling behind? In the spring of 1980, there were national polls, the Lou Harris poll, the Gallup poll, that had shown me with anywhere between 25 and 30% of the voters saying yes, they could see themselves voting for me as their candidate for president. And of course, that was very reassuring back in the spring of that year. But after the conventions, traditional party loyalties and allegiances seemed to reassert themselves, and we gradually declined in the polls until by September we were in the 10% range. Initially, that was enough to get me in one presidential debate. There aren't all of you here, but some of you may remember that far back, that on the 28th of September in a city 40 miles from here, namely the city of Baltimore, Ronald Reagan and I appeared on the stage together and debated the issues of the 1980 campaign. The incumbent president, Jimmy Carter, refused to appear. He said, "I'm not going to get on the stage with two Republicans." He seemed to forget that I had made it abundantly clear and very dramatically clear, I thought, back in April of 1980, that I was leaving the party, that I was willfully and in good faith assuming the mantle and the role of an independent candidate. Be that as it may, we had a debate alone that evening. We had a nationwide audience, and not every network, but I think 2 out of the 3 at that time major networks covered the debate, as did PBS. And it gave us some additional free media that was terribly important, because, as I started to say, we had spent so much money simply gaining access to the ballot that even though I had one of the media mavens of that time, David Garth from New York City, as my campaign manager, he had precious little money to spend on paid commercial advertising. When I read of the vast sums of money that have been assembled today by candidates on both sides of the major party political aisle for the primary campaign, I am truly aghast, because in the case of one candidate who reputedly has raised $67 million, that is about the sum that I think one of the two major parties spent in the general election campaign. Ronald Reagan had a little more money and spent in excess of that amount. I had only a fraction of that amount of money available for the general election campaign. But paid media is what is driving the political process today. And it reminds me of something that one of the early political bosses of the Republican Party, Mark Hanna, is reported to have said, that there are only two things that are important in politics. One is money, and then he paused and said, and I can't remember the other. The other famous line that I sometimes repeat is from a Neil Diamond song: money talks, but it don't dance and sing. Well, he was only half right. He was only half right. It does talk. But I am afraid today that there are candidates who are dancing and singing to the tune piped by contributors. And that's why I feel so strongly. I felt strongly about public financing way back 27 years ago. I'm not exactly a Johnny-come-lately. The late Morris Udall, great congressman from the state of Arizona, who was my bosom friend in the Congress. He a Democrat, I at that time a Republican. Worked and collaborated together on various pieces of legislation. One of them was the Alaska National Interest Lands Bill that put literally millions of acres, saved them from the developer's blade, put them in conservation reserves and national forests and so on. I wasn't very popular in Alaska, neither was he. As a matter of fact, in my campaign in 1980, I visited virtually every state in the Union but two. One was Hawaii, and at that time, Hawaii was such a strongly Democratic state. It's become, I think, a little more evenly balanced today, that it seemed like it wasn't worth the vast expenditure of time and money that it would take to campaign there. And the other state that I didn't go to of the 50 was the state of Alaska, because they said they will hang you an effigy if you appear in Alaska. They are out to get you because of the Alaska National Interest Lands Bill. But more importantly, for the purposes of our discussion this afternoon, the legislation that Mo Udall and I sponsored provided for at least the partial public financing of political campaigns, for the matching of small contributions of $100 or less from the federal checkoff fund, which had earlier been established in the Federal Elections Campaign Act of 1971. We would have matched small contributions in the general election for members of the House. We didn't try to deal with the Senate, where races have become even more prohibitively expensive because the Senate does not take too kindly to the other body, as they refer to the House of Representatives, trying to legislate on the subject of their finances. But we failed. We failed in that effort. Legislation that, as I recall it, was introduced first in 1973. And today, 27, 28 years later, we are confronted, I think, with the necessity, once again, of looking at money in politics and the impact that it has and the effect that it has on the electorate as something that is not good. When you think of all of the money that is spent today, and you maybe have heard these figures from others that have appeared before you, Some people say as much as $2.5 billion was spent in the election cycle that culminated in 1996 with the presidential election. The congressional elections at all levels probably cost $2.5 billion. I have seen estimates that it may go over $3 billion in the year 2000 election. And I equate that, or I put it together rather, with the fact that instead of that vast outpouring and expenditure of money having a desirable effect and improving and increasing public interest and knowledge about the campaign and about the issues, it seems to have had exactly the opposite effect. And I don't have to remind you that in both 1992 and 1996, less than 50% of the voters in this country who were eligible to ballot, to cast a vote, participated in selecting a person for the highest office in the land. I think that's a bad signal. I think your generation, the generation of young people seated in these rows before me this afternoon here in Washington, D.C., can have no more important task than to try to change the laws of our country to provide for public financing of campaigns. All of the proposals that have been made, and I don't want to diminish the good faith and the reputation of anyone in this area, but the two candidates, one from the Republican Party and one from the Democratic Party, that just a couple of weeks ago up in Claremont, New Hampshire, went through the ritualistic handshake as had occurred between Newt Gingrich and President Clinton back in 1996. I think that was the year, or 1995, perhaps. They pledged that they were going to clean up this very serious problem of money in politics. And in the latter instance, I'm referring now to the pledge that was taken by Senator McCain and Senator Bradley. They said that they would pledge to go to their party and say, don't use any so-called soft money in our campaign that can be given, of course, in unregulated amounts of any denomination. That isn't enough. That is only part of the problem. And the reason why Public Campaign, one of the organizations fighting for reform in this area, denounced the compromise that was attempted in November, last November, 1999, just before the conclusion of the first session of the 106th Congress. There was a proposal to limit soft money contributions to $60,000 and at the same time to increase contributions presently limited to $2,000 a year, $1,000 in the primary, $1,000 in the general election, that can be made to candidates who are campaigning for federal office. As long as you have private money, private contributions flowing into the system, there are going to be found ways to circumvent whatever law is enacted. And the light up here is so poor, I don't know whether I can even read something that I brought with me, published by a very dear friend of mine who feels as strongly as I do on this important subject, Professor Raskin and John Bonifaz of the National Voting Rights Institute, in the Columbia Law Review, had this to say: money is unequally distributed, which means that persons who have more wealth can buy more goods. And under that heading of goods, of course, we're talking about media, including political and governmental favors. And hear me out, only one additional sentence. At the same time, however, modern democracies are inspired and legitimated by the political principle of one person, one vote, which expresses the ideal of the equal standing of all citizens and the equal importance of their needs and wishes. Equal standing and equal needs and equal wishes. The principle of equality in our society is being subverted because we worship at the idol of campaign finance and say we can write laws that will somehow legitimate this practice that is costing us more and more and more as time goes on, even as public apathy, public distrust, public disinterest in government is increasing. No, I feel as strongly, more strongly by far than I did when that first campaign reform bill was put in back in 1973, that we've got to do something about money in politics. That means public financing, to acknowledge that an election is a public function. And what is improper? What is improper about the taxpayer and the public paying for a function that is as important as selecting representatives of the people, as electing their president, with the assurance that that person is not going to assume office and take the oath already compromised by the fact that he has been able to accept contributions that in turn are clearly intended to influence his vote. I remember once when the former candidate for the presidency on the Republican Party ticket, Senator Robert Dole, and he and I wore our freshman beanies together in the 87th Congress. We were seatmates as fellow freshmen in that Congress. And before he began running for the presidency, he made the statement, you know, it's funny, of all the interest groups, of all the political action committees that I read about, there aren't any poor people's PACs. No, it is special interest money that is flowing into political action committees, that is being given by individuals, that is influencing legislative policy, and I would insist that that is subverting this very important principle of one person, one vote. One person's needs being as important as another person's needs. I can well remember, and perhaps some of you do, back in 1952, when that great decision was handed down in Baker versus Carr, Supreme Court case, one person, one vote. And I can remember being in the Congress and being so proud to be a part of those who voted for and fought for the civil rights legislation that we enacted in the 1960s, acts like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Why did we enact that legislation? It was in the name of equality, to make sure that people had not only the right to go to the polls, not to be turned back because of literacy tests or because of other barriers that were put in the way of the expressive act of voting, pulling the lever, punching the card, marking an X. There is also an instrumental aspect to voting. The instrumental aspect means that you have a right to expect that in securing your needs, in carrying out the kind of policies that you think would be best for you and for the income class in which you belong or in which you happen to be a part, that you aren't going to be outvoted, you aren't going to be outweighed in the political scales of justice by people who have put so much more money on those set of balances, on those scales, that their voice is going to be heard over your voice and those like you who are similarly situated. Now, the other great aspect of voting today that disturbs me is that I think our first past the post, our plurality system of voting makes it very difficult for new parties with new ideas to be established in the political topsoil of our country. Back in 1854, when the Republican Party was established as a second major political party, replacing the Whig Party. It was a little bit different. It was a little bit different back in that time, because in the very first election in which they participated, they won a plurality of the congressional vote. And it was because of that congressional presence that they then nominated and ran, although he lost in the first election that the Republicans had a candidate, John G. Fremont, in 1856. 4 years later, Abraham Lincoln elected as a Republican president. They had first established a presence in the Congress. You can count on the fingers of one hand how many independents you have in the Congress today. You know as well as I, there's only one from the state of Vermont, the Honorable Bernie Sanders. It is virtually impossible for new parties, for third parties, to elect members to the House of Representatives, and even more unlikely and impossible to elect them to the United States Senate. Now, to talk about the importance of electoral systems on the election of a candidate, there is one statewide official today in the country who was elected on a third-party ticket. Who was he? Yeah, Ventura. He was elected with a very narrow margin, as I recall it, 3 percentage points, with about 37% of the vote. And he was elected by young people who streamed to the polls and who came in and registered and voted on the very same day. Without that contingent of youthful voters who had never before registered but found out that under the laws of that state they could go in and register and at the same time also ask for a ballot and cast a vote, I'm personally convinced that it was the winning margin. There was another factor, though, that is worth mentioning, and it goes back to the topic that really we started to discuss, and that is the free media. There were, I believe, a total of 5 statewide debates, and he was in every one of those debates. And I was in Minneapolis the middle of November last year, and I talked to Governor Ventura at the time, and he told me that on the night of that last debate, literally a third of the entire estimated listening television audience in the whole state of Minnesota was watching that debate. And he won. And I think because of his appearance in the debates, because of same-day registration, changed the law, let people register and vote in the same election, you did have a Reform Party, third party, new party candidate elected governor. So I could talk about other changes that I think ought to be made. I would like to see us elect a president in this country the same way they elect the president of Ireland, Mary Robinson, who is now, I believe, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, was elected president of Ireland under a system of choice voting. And Australia, I believe, is another country that uses it, where the voter is given a ballot, and there are 3 people who are running. The voter is given the privilege of saying, this is my first choice, number 1, opposite this name, number 2, my second choice, and then he may or may not mark a third choice. The fact is, then, that in tabulating the votes, if no one has a majority, we believe in majority rule, I do, and I'm sure you do as well. If no one has a majority of the votes when they are counted, you then take and transfer the second place vote of the candidate who is then eliminated from any further role in the counting process. Take the second choice votes of that candidate who has been eliminated, assign them to one of the 2 remaining candidates, and in that way you can determine who has the majority. I tell you all of this because if there was one thing that, one question that haunted me in the press conferences, and I'm getting back to media again, the free media that I got was in daily press conferences. The only problem is that when you try to hold a press conference every day, and when the press insists on asking you virtually the same question, after a while it really isn't news. Because the one question that they would always ask was, well, you have declined in the polls. You are going down. In the spring, you were 25%. Now you're down to 10%. What do you have to say about that? The fact of the matter is that if you had choice voting, as I have described, it would enable candidates to receive the first place vote of those who really believed in the integrity of his program and in the policies that he advocated. And they wouldn't feel that they were throwing away their vote, because if he didn't win, they could always mark a second choice. In 1980, it would have been obviously Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter. And that second place vote would then play a part in determining a winner. If your first choice candidate is eliminated because he is the low man on the totem pole. A system of choice voting, I think, would eliminate that wasted vote feeling that has kept people from voting for independent or third-party candidates. Well, I've talked, Steve, longer than I thought I would. But am I correct that you customarily take questions, and I see the hands are already starting to pop up around the room. You've been marvelously attentive. I could say about our political system that I think need changing, but if we run out of questions, I promise you we'll fill up the time available.
I don't think we'll run out of questions. It takes just a second to get the microphone from one position to another, so our television audience can share the question.
All right.
And other than that, you're on your own, sir.
My name is Alexander DeMarco from the University.
Would you speak right into the microphone so that I can be sure to hear your question?
You'll have to speak up.
My name is Alexander DeMarco from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Incidentally, though, I live in Rockford, Illinois.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
Yes.
Fellow townsman.
Yes.
My hometown, in case you didn't know.
I'm wondering, you say that now there's so much of the electorate now that is registered as or is said in polls that they are independent. I'm wondering, why is it now then that we're hearing so much in this conference that third-party politics is not going to play a role this year? Why is it now the time, with the election of Ventura and everything, for third-party politics to come into play? And also, I hear from my father back home on the local news that there's rumors of yourself looking at that. Is that true? Or I don't know. That's what my father says.
Well, that question I was sure would recur at this meeting. What happened, I think, is that some weeks ago, a young man from my home state of Illinois, whom I've known for a number of years, who is now a third-year law student at the University of Chicago, started a website on the internet. And on his website, in addition to including a picture of me and some of my ideas and beliefs, he made a plea for a draft. I said to him, Dan, isn't it a little presumptuous to think that the American people are going to think that it's a credible thing to talk about drafting a presidential candidate? Here are candidates raising $67 million to go out and get the nomination. They want it so badly. How do you think the public will react to the idea of a draft? Well, he was stubborn in his belief that on the internet there are a lot of people surfing those channels, and that he would pick up some support. While he was doing that, the people in the state of California, the California Reform Party, which has its own niche on the ballot or has access to the ballot in that state, went ahead and gave my name to the Secretary of State. I did not authorize the placing of my name on the ballot. I was called by the Secretary of State and said, the chairman of the party and the coordinator of the party have forwarded your name. It will be on the March 7th ballot in California. So if any of you are from California, that's probably one of the names you will see. And it will be under the California Reform Party. But I have not made a decision. I have not made a declaration of candidacy. I am presently very active in a nonprofit organization, and I have work to do there. And I would have to lay that aside, obviously, were I to become a candidate. And I'm talking about the World Federalist Association, which has its national office in Washington. And that lays very heavily on my heart as an organization whose work needs to be done. So I have to decide sometime between now and in the next few weeks whether or not I'm going to honor the pleas of the people in that state and various others who have suggested that I become a candidate. So I can't give you an answer today as to what that decision will be. Now, to go back, though, to the part of your question that relates to independence. Unfortunately, the Reform Party is in a state of some disarray. And the chairman, a man whom I've known for the last 10 years, he's a Floridian, Jack Gargan, was quoted, I think, either yesterday or the day before, as lamenting the fact that the party was divided. You have one wing in Dallas, and you have another wing represented by the Minnesota Reform Party. And I guess you would have to say there's another wing out there in California too, because they were the ones who suggested my name. So unfortunately, that party is not united at the moment. And I believe that when a party develops wings before it is really quite ready to fly, that's not a good thing at all. They were successful. The Reform Party was successful way back in 1992, when almost 1 out of every 5 voters, you will recall, cast a vote for, it wasn't then called the Reform Party. I don't think it was simply independent in many states. But I'm talking about the Pearl candidacy in 1992 that got almost 19% of the vote. There was a great burning issue. It was the deficit. And the fact that he convinced the American people, and he deserves credit for what he did at that time, that neither party was dealing adequately with the issue of the federal deficit. And he convinced, as I say, that 19%, that it would take a new approach and a new party with him at its head to deal with that problem. You know what happened. He didn't win. A Democrat was elected. The Democrats and the Republicans scratched their heads and say, hey, the people don't seem to like too well what either one of us is doing. We better get together. And so they decided that they would deal with the deficit. Now, to some extent, they were the beneficiaries of an awful lot of good luck. The economic resurgence that began in 1992 has continued at a rapid pace, and with swelling revenues, swollen treasuries, the deficit has been eliminated. And now the big debate is raging over how to deal with the surplus. Do we pay down the debt? Do we save Social Security? Do we put it into education? All these other suggestions. The Reform Party has got to adopt positions that will enable the people to look at that party, no matter who the candidate may be, and say they've got new ideas, different ideas, and the other parties aren't really dealing with it. Therefore, we should vote for them. Now, I tried in the few minutes that I had with you this morning to talk about public financing of campaigns. Now, I know that there's some of the candidates on the Democratic side that are talking now in terms of public financing, and I'm not accusing anybody of bad faith, but I'm suggesting that when you look at the parties behind them, whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, I don't feel very much confidence in their ability to get legislation out of the U.S. Congress that will give us the kind of clean money option that was adopted, for example, in Maine in 1995, where candidates take a pledge that they will not accept private contributions, and the legislature then appropriates the money that will conduct this public function we call an election and pay for a reasonable amount of advertising and so on. So I think the party at the moment, more important than individuals, this party has got to establish a clear position on some issues like that and others as well to begin to draw public attention back to the Reform Party. We are much too candidate conscious and even celebrity candidate conscious today. And we need to get back, I think, to the idea that issues are more important than individual candidates. And that's the only way that I know, if I were to recommend to the Reform Party a course of action that would get them back together. They've got to unite on principles and on a program.
Hi, my name is Ana Pereira from Bowling Green State University in Ohio. I would like to put the Reform Party aside a little bit and talk about another reform. We spent part of this week talking about globalization and the role of the media in this globalization. I'd like to ask a question regarding the UN reform. The former Secretary Boutros Boutros-Ghali, in his book Unvanished, a U.S. and UN Saga, claimed that he was the only UN secretary that was not allowed to run for a second term. And according to him, that was because the U.S. did not support his reforms, and the U.S. being one of the great debtors of the UN. I wanted to know, in your opinion, how do you see the U.S. and UN relationship in the present days, and what do you think the media could do to help in this relationship?
Well, thank you very much for your question, because I think that as we look to this new millennium, as we look to the kind of American foreign policy that we ought to pursue in the 21st century, it ought to involve an empowered and a strengthened United Nations, and there is much truth, I am afraid, to what Boutros Boutros-Ghali had to say in the book to which you refer, that the opposition to his having a second five-year term was led by the United States. I happen to be one of those who read and took seriously the Agenda for Peace program that he wrote in 1992, which was about, I think, the next to the last year, if I remember correctly, of his five-year term. He had been asked by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council to draw up a plan for the future of the United Nations, and in it, in his book or in his recommendation, which was called An Agenda for Peace, he specifically recommended that under Articles 43 through Articles 48 of Chapter 7, the peacekeeping article of the Charter, that nations ought to be willing to contribute forces to a UN peacekeeping force that could be used to keep peace in the world. We preferred not to listen to that particular recommendation. And as a result, the United Nations has not been as significant a force and as effectual as I think it could be in keeping peace in the world. One of the things I believe very strongly in is that there ought to be a ready response force available to the United Nations. President Clinton campaigned in 1992 advocating that very thing. He was critical of the Bush administration because following the decision of Slovenia to leave the former Yugoslav Federation and the situation then deteriorated and the struggle broke out between the Croats and the Muslims and the Bosnian Serbs. He was very critical of the inability of the administration to get a policy together in time to prevent the horrible things that then followed in the genocidal slaughter that occurred. And so I think we ought to have a stronger UN. We ought to have one with independent forces under the mandate of the Security Council. I'm not suggesting that we are simply going to make the Secretary General into some kind of a world dictator. He would be under the mandate of the Security Council. But we need to look to the UN. It needs to be reformed. I don't like the present voting system. I don't think it's very democratic. A little island in the Indian Ocean with 60,000 people has one vote, and the PRC or the Russian Federation or India with hundreds of millions of people have one vote. We ought to go to a system of weighted voting. The European Union has done that. It's enabled them to achieve the broader unity of purpose that has held that 15 nations, soon to be 19 nations, and I think now the plan is by 2025 that 29 countries will have joined the European Union. And they are doing it on a rational plan and basis of weighting the votes of the individual members of the Union. We ought to have a system of weighted voting in the United Nations. They ought to have an independent force capable of keeping the peace. And we should not marginalize the UN and look at it simply as an organization. Well, if it's handy to use it, if it's convenient to our purposes, we'll go to the UN, otherwise we'll go it alone. One of the candidates now for the Reform Party nomination very flatly says that we ought to reconstruct Fortress America. We ought to get ourselves into a mode and into a posture where we can simply be the great decider of disputes. And I think that is basically tragically flawed, that kind of reasoning. I find it so difficult to understand why people accept the fact that we have a global economy today and we talk about globalization. If you have an economy in the world that is globalized, we need some political structures. Carefully, their powers have to be very carefully delineated. My organization, the World Federalists, believes very frankly that we ought to go back to our founding fathers and the wisdom that they showed at Philadelphia in constructing a federal system where certain powers were confided to the national government. The powers, as you know, under the 10th Amendment, not so delegated, reserved to the states or to the people. We ought to have that kind of confederation in the world capable of acting and keeping the peace, and it ought to be a very fundamental part of American foreign policy in the century that has now dawned.
Mike Iris, Ohio Northern. It's been said that most Americans in some form or another do belong to a special interest group, and that for that reason, special interest groups are representative of the voice of the people. To what extent do you believe interest groups have a legitimate role in American politics?
Well, certainly there is more than a modicum of truth to the point that you make, that we tend to associate together with people who are like-minded and who share a common or a similar interest. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with that kind of association. Now, Madison, in his famous Federalist Paper number 10, warned about the spirit of faction. And he identified faction with parties. Back in the 18th century, parties were a known thing. They knew about parties. Our forefathers who had come from Great Britain or from England. But it was his dream, and our system was constructed with the belief and the hope that in the deliberations that took place in this new representative body that they were creating in the form of a Congress of the United States, that what would emerge would be the common good, that there would not be the destructive spirit of faction arrayed against faction that would cause the public good to be lost in the process. And yet, sadly enough, by 1796, George Washington, our first president, in his farewell address, was warning about the spirit of party taking over. And what has made the situation even worse, I think, is that the parties today have become the vast treasuries that they are, collecting money from these various interest groups. I don't think there's anything wrong in people getting together and lobbying. The members of the organization that I had at the grassroots call on their congressperson. They come to Washington at our annual spring meeting, which will be held in March, and they'll be knocking on doors, asking them to vote for the kind of legislation that I spoke of earlier when I was discussing the UN. Nothing wrong with interest groups, but when it is the power of money that is injected into the process, and when we get it in these enormous sums and concentrated in a few hands, and when we lose sight of this very important principle of equality, then I think we do great harm and great damage. It's not that special interests will not arise, but we have to govern those interests with the kind of laws and with the kind of regulations that will assure us that it's not their money that is speaking, that it is the conviction rather of the people who have associated together to push a program or a point of view that is being heard. Today, money, I think, is having a drowning out effect. So much money is being spent, and when it's being spent by just a few candidates and emphasizing a few issues, it is drowning out the kind of legitimate debate and discussion that is healthy in a democracy.
We have one more question. Let's go back over here. Someone who hasn't asked a question yet today. I see young woman. You haven't?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
My name is Jeff Belomo, and I'm from Juniata College in Huntington, Pennsylvania. You've mentioned some of your opinions and views about the electoral process.
Yeah.
And I would like to specifically ask you about the Electoral College. Many people say that it's the most undemocratic thing that we do. What are your views on it?
Some of my answers have tended to be, frankly, too long, and you have been very kind and very patient. I think I can give a relatively short answer. Way back, I think it was in 1969, I supported legislation in the form of a congressional resolution that would amend the Constitution to abolish the Electoral College. I cannot see that whatever justification may have existed back in 1787 to insulate the people from the actual choice of a president by interposing this body of an Electoral College, that reasoning should prevail today. I would vote to abolish the Electoral College.
John, we don't want to influence your vote too much.
Oh, no.
But we do have a payoff. And it is in the form of a marvelous T-shirt.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Representing the goals of the Washington Center for Internships and Academic Seminars.
Thank you very much.
We thank you again for your participation. For those of you on television, the audience here, nearly 200 college students from around the country who are part of a 2-week seminar on campaign politics and the media, sponsored by the Washington Center for Academic Seminars and Internships. And we thank you for joining us, and we will adjourn the session right now. Thank you.
Well, I'll get back to my day job.
John Anderson.